It's the year 1095, and things have been going horribly wrong for Pope Urban II. A few decades earlier, the once unified Christian church had fractured into two churches, with the Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox Church in the east. This split, known as the Great Schism, had instantly cut the Pope's authority over all Christians in half. In Europe, where he was still the Christian commander-in-chief, his followers were not getting along and were instead busy going to war with each other. And if that wasn't bad enough, Muslim empires like the Seljuk Turks have been conquering Christian lands throughout the Middle East and had even taken control of the Holy Lands and Jerusalem itself. But out of the blue, messengers from Constantinople arrived with a request from Alexios Komnenos, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. In his letter, he requests the aid of his Christian brothers to beat back the Muslim invaders who have been encroaching on his lands. And in this plea for help, Pope Urban sees an opportunity to solve all of his problems at once. So in November of 1095, he calls together the most influential people in Europe and holds the Council of Clermont. In front of this crowd, he gives a speech so epic, it unites all of Europe for the first time in over a century. The soldiers of Christ will march east and take back the Holy Land for their Lord and free their Christian brothers from the tyranny of Islam once and for all. This crusade, yes, I like that name, is totally just about that, and definitely not about exerting dominance over the Eastern Orthodox Church. Oh, and by the way, if you go and fight, God will forgive all your sins and stuff, and you get to go to heaven for free. The crowd erupts into cheers. Deus Vult, they begin to chant. It is the will of God! And with that, the age of the Crusades has begun. But just one problem. See, sometimes getting people this fired up can sometimes make people take action without fully thinking things through. So, unsurprisingly, some of the Crusades went horribly wrong. Like this one, for example. Number 1, the People's Crusade. So, there's this guy in France, Peter the Hermit, who gets wind of Pope Urban's epic speech, and he's fired up. He starts riding around France on his donkey doing his best Pope Urban impression, giving speeches and sermons about taking back the Holy Land. He has an everyman appeal, and before you know it, he's managed to assemble an army of 40,000 followers. But there's just one problem. Peter's army was made up of almost exclusively peasants. We're talking men, women, children, old people who had never left their village. Combat experience? Just a few low-level knights amongst them. Supplies? Pfft, who needs that? Deus Vult, it's God's will! So in April of 1096, Peter's mob of holy hobos starts marching east, months before the official start date of the Crusades. They make it to Rhineland, an area in modern-day Germany, and surprise, surprise, they run out of food and they get hungry. And this is where things start to get a little out of hand. This hungry mob, still whipped up into a religious fervor by Peter the Hermit, sets their sights on the only non-Christians in the area, the Jews, and begins slaughtering them and looting their homes. Local Catholic bishops in the area try their best to hide and protect the fleeing Jews, but by the time Peter's mob had passed, casualties were in the thousands. Now, apparently, looting is one of those things that once you get a taste of it, it's really hard to stop. So the People's Crusade goes on to pillage every town and village they encounter on their way to Constantinople. They pass through Hungary, no pun intended, and with no Jews or Muslims in the area, they go ahead and start pillaging Christian towns instead. The mob makes their way into the Balkans, now officially in the Eastern Roman Empire, the land they came to defend from those evil Muslims. And they're looting again. First, they arrive at the city of Belgrade, which refused to let them enter, so they began pillaging the towns around the walls. They went on to sack the provincial capital of Niš. The plunderous pilgrims make it all the way to the walls of Constantinople, and Emperor Alexios looks out at this dirty mob of hungry and angry peasants. He's like, this is the help the Pope sent. Oh great, now they're looting my towns. And so the mob begins raiding towns around Constantinople, and Alexios has to send out his army to deal with these peasants who were only there because he requested help from the Pope in the first place. He quickly makes arrangements to get this mob out of his lands and helps Peter and his army get across the Bosphorus Strait. Finally, they're gonna get to go head-to-head against those Muslims. But there's just one small issue. Many of the villages and townspeople on this side of the Bosphorus were still technically Roman and actually still Christian. You know, the ones the Crusaders were supposed to be coming to protect. But the mob didn't seem bothered by that technicality and continued to raid and steal from these towns as well. They make it to a city called Nicomedia, located at the edge of the empire, and this unruly mob of peasants, against all odds, miraculously find themselves within striking distance of Nicaea, the city that hosted the Council of Nicaea, birthplace of modern Christianity itself. Peter tells his followers that they should wait here for the rest of the crusade to meet up before going any further, and his mob did not like that one bit. They want to go now. Peter realizes he's lost all control of his mob and heads back to Constantinople to get supplies. Spoiler alert, he never comes back. The group then splits in two factions who get into sort of a pissing contest to see which group is better at pillaging. Now, the Turkish Sultan's getting tired of this mob in his territory causing all these problems, so he sends out his professionally trained army, and unsurprisingly, against a mob of dumb peasants, they easily catch one of the groups who were out raiding and kill everyone who doesn't convert to Islam. They then send a message back to the remaining crusaders that the group they just took out actually managed to take control of Nicaea.
Holy they got Nicaea? Are you fucking kidding me? We can't let those idiots take all the good stuff.
And so the remaining 20,000 peasant crusaders go rushing off to get their share of the loot without a second thought. They follow the road into a narrow wooded valley, chanting rally cries and shouting like they're going to watch their team play in the Super Bowl or something. But unbeknownst to the crusaders, the entire Turkish army had been waiting in the darkness for their arrival. When the entire mob had entered the valley, the Turkish soldiers ambushed them and slaughter almost every single one of them. The 3,000 or so that made it out hole up in a fort until the real crusaders come and rescue them. Now, this People's Crusade, though a complete shit show, did have real-world effects for the first official crusade. See, the Sultan assumed that this mob of peasants were the best Europe had to offer, and he seriously underestimated the real First Crusade when they reached his land. In fact, the shit show that was the Peasants' Crusade is probably one of the biggest reasons the First Crusade went on to be the most successful crusade of them all. But that doesn't mean it wasn't without its own fucked up parts, like this one for instance. Number 2, the Siege of Mara. Okay, so now we're in the first real crusade, and the Holy Army from Europe has steamrolled its way well into Turkish territory. These guys are actually real knights and soldiers this time, so they've been much more successful than Peter's mob, and in just 2 years have reclaimed a large portion of former Christian territory. However, in 1098, they arrive at the city of Antioch, and this one, for some reason, is way harder to conquer than the ones they've conquered so far. The siege goes on for months, and the Crusaders use up all of their supplies in the process. Now starving outside the city walls, they're eating anything and everything they can find. Their horses, donkeys, dogs, cats, rats, tree bark, even the leather from their armor and shoes. But even that quickly runs out, and many begin to starve to death. After 8 months, they finally bribe a defender within the city, and the Crusaders rush in, driven mad by hunger and the resentment of months of resistance, and they begin ruthlessly slaughtering thousands of townspeople. But after the dust settles and they begin to search for food, they find that the city is barren. What little they find is nowhere near enough to feed them all. Before they even have a chance to come up with their next idea, a massive Turkish relief army arrives and traps the Crusaders inside the city. The men inside realize that this is probably the end of their journey. They're exhausted and literally starving to death. But miraculously, a monk amongst their ranks is guided by a vision to a spot in the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. He begins to dig there and finds what he instantly recognizes as the Holy Lance, the very spear that was thrust into Jesus when he was on the cross. He holds it up for the Crusaders to see, and they take it as a sign from God and are re-energized by their faith. Though massively outnumbered, they storm out of the city walls, taking the Turks by surprise, and with the last bits of strength, defeat the army outside the city. But while they can now move on from Antioch, the victory did nothing to fix their food situation. So the Crusaders travel to a port town called Mara, thinking a trading port should have all the food they need to continue their quest. Now fueled only by primitive instincts to survive, the Crusaders construct an enormous siege tower and begin a deadly siege on the city. The Muslim defenders put up a heavy resistance, but the Crusaders make their way into the city in December, and now, having lost their humanity to starvation, begin massacring everyone there. They begin searching for food, but they're horrified to discover that the townspeople of Mara were also starving. The city had no food at all. It's at this point, driven mad by hunger, the Crusaders do the unthinkable. They look to the slain Muslim townspeople. Their bodies, like the Crusaders, were also reduced to skin and bones. An ultra-religious group called the Tarfurs then begin explaining to everyone that they're all here to do God's bidding, and eating non-Christian flesh is technically still a win for their god because, less non-Christians equal more Christians. And so they begin to savagely rip off the clothing from the dead and begin to slice chunks of flesh from the buttocks of the deceased. They then quickly began roasting the human flesh over a fire, with some reportedly so hungry that they couldn't wait for the meat to be cooked all the way through before devouring it like wild animals. Word spread through the Turkish Empire about the warriors from the West who eat humans, and Muslim cities start surrendering left and right. Nobody wants to be the next item on the menu, and the Crusaders manage to take back Jerusalem, but at the cost of, becoming cannibals in the process. Number 3, the Fourth Crusade. So, it's been over a century of crusading shenanigans. The Christians managed to get a hold of Jerusalem for a while, which was huge considering Muslims had controlled it for over 450 years, only to lose it back during the Third Crusade. So in 1202, Pope Innocent III is all, "Hey, it was pretty sweet when we had Jerusalem back, let's go get it again." But walking across Europe takes forever, so they come up with a better plan. Get an army together, sail to Egypt, the Muslim powerhouse, knock them out first, then march to Jerusalem. But first, the Crusaders need to figure out a way to sail there. So they travel to Venice and make a deal with the Doge, a guy named Enrico Dandolo, to provide ships for their army. And this single act changes the course of human history as we know it. See, decades ago, Dandolo was just a regular Venetian trader, and on a business trip to Constantinople, he gets into a heated argument with some Byzantine traders. During the argument, someone clubs him in the head so hard that he goes blind. Though he's able to continue his business and eventually becomes the top dog in Venice, he's never able to see again. And because of this, he never forgives the Byzantines for the rest of his life. So Dandolo, who's like 90 years old now, gets a message from the Crusaders about needing ships, and he agrees to build them this massive fleet. We're talking 50 warships and enough transport ships for 33,500 men. The price tag? 85,000 silver marks, about $750 million in today's money. It's a lot, but the Crusaders run some numbers and figure out that if everyone who's supposed to come chips in, they'll be able to afford the ships. One tiny problem though. Only about 12,000 Crusaders actually show up. The Crusaders can't pay, and this is music to Dandolo's ears. He knows from his years in business that there's no better way to control humans than debt. If he plays his cards right, he essentially gets to control this giant army and can make them do whatever he wants. The Crusaders really need these ships, so they ask if there's any other way they can pay for them. And upon hearing this, Dandolo smiles and suggests to the Crusaders that they make a quick stop to visit his old friends at Constantinople.
This is a pretty rich city. You could probably find some money to pay for these ships there, if you know what I mean. Okay. Can we use your ships to get there? No.
So the Crusaders find this other guy with ships named Alexios Angelos, who said he can help them get there. Just one condition though. He's like,
"Help me become Byzantine emperor and I'll pay your debt, give you supplies, and send troops to Jerusalem."
See, his dad, Isaac Angelos, was actually the Byzantine emperor just a few short years ago, but was blinded and deposed by his brother for some reason. He was probably a huge asshole. So Alexios wants to reclaim what he thinks is his birthright. The Crusaders shrug and say, "F*** it," and sail to Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world, the very city that started the Crusades in the first place, and sack it. They put Alexios on the throne, but after the deed's done and the Crusaders ask for their payment, surprise, he can't pay up either. The Byzantines, not really happy with their new emperor, are like,
"Boo, Alexios sucks. Just like his dad."
And they strangle him to death. Riots erupt, and the Crusaders, seeing the chaos they accidentally caused, decide,
"You know what? Screw it. Let's just take Constantinople for ourselves."
And so they do. In April 1204, they breach the walls of the city again and absolutely wreck the place. We're talking about 2,000 civilians killed, churches stripped bare, and ancient holy relics treated like yard sale merchandise. The Crusaders end up dividing the Byzantine Empire, creating this thing called the Latin Empire. Venice gets the best trade ports, giving Dandolo the revenge he was looking for, and various Crusader lords get to play emperor and king in lands they barely understand. Though the Byzantine Empire is eventually re-established about 50 years later, it never fully recovers, making it way easier for the Ottoman Turks to eventually take over, and the split between Catholic and Orthodox Christians becomes basically permanent. So yeah, basically the Fourth Crusade ended with Crusaders destroying the largest Christian city in the East and overthrowing the very empire that requested their help. They never even got close to Jerusalem. Number 4. The Children's Crusade. In 1212, shortly after the Fourth Crusade, where the Crusaders wrecked Constantinople, a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen in France is handed a letter from Jesus himself. Or at least that's what he tells everyone. According to Stephen, Jesus picked him to lead an army of children to take back Jerusalem. Jesus told him children can't be damned for murder and pillaging since they're too young to commit actual sins. What a loophole! Now, Stephen can't read. Actually, nobody can read in 1212 except monks and nobles, but that doesn't stop him from telling everyone that this is what the letter says, and that God wants all you kids to get out there and show the adults how a crusade is really done. Stephen's actually really good at public speaking, and thousands join him, mostly kids and teenagers, but he actually gets some adults to join his crusade as well. Stephen brings his followers to Paris to tell King Philip II that he and his followers are ready for their crusade. And the king's like, "Yeah, you kids should go home." But Stephen's crew is fired up, and they ignore the king's orders and begin their march across Europe towards the Middle East. Now, God works in mysterious ways, and at the exact same time in Germany, this other kid, Nicholas, who's also received a message from God, is doing exactly the same thing. And he also manages to convince another 20,000 kids to follow him, and they begin their own journey towards Jerusalem. Nicholas decides that the shortest route to their goal is a march across the Alps. But remember, these are kids organizing this, so they don't think about the details, and soon find themselves walking through the Alps in summer clothes with no food or supplies. They're basically in flip-flops in negative 20-degree weather, so yeah, lots of them die. The survivors reach the city of Genoa, and this was Nicholas's big moment. He turns to his exhausted followers and tells them that God himself told him he would part the Mediterranean Sea just like he did the Red Sea for Moses. Nicholas and his followers wade out into the water with conviction and wait for their sign from God. And nothing happened. With no miracle, Nicholas and his group gave up their crusade and started the journey home. And unsurprisingly, even more kids die on the way back through the Alps. Somehow Nicholas survives his crusade and gets home to Cologne, but when he shows up with just a handful of the 20,000 kids he left with, the parents of these kids who didn't make it are pissed they were fooled by this brat and end up hanging Nicholas for revenge. As for Stephen, somewhere along their journey, his group ran into some merchants who offered them free rides to Jerusalem. Turns out these were the wrong kind of merchants, and Stephen and his crew quickly became their inventory, and they were reportedly all sold into slavery. Now, surprisingly, the failed children's crusades actually had a pretty huge impact on Pope Innocent III. He watched these kids, equipped with literally nothing but faith alone, make it all the way to Genoa, and he uses the story to inspire the soldiers of the Fifth Crusade. Because honestly, getting to Genoa without, conquering or pillaging a major Christian city was pretty good compared to some of the earlier crusades.